Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to be spoken aloud. There's a reason files vanish, witnesses grow silent, and whole families disappear without a single sound. In the autumn of 1965, on a wind-beaten edge of Yorkshire, a family of 4 stepped across an invisible threshold and fell out of our world. But the truth is this: the Higgins family didn't just vanish. They were taken by a system older than the church itself, older than England itself, a system hiding in plain sight beneath stone, ritual, and obedience. You can feel it already, can't you? That prickling at the back of your neck, that's the place where your inherited programming collides with forbidden knowledge. In Ashworth Village, under the respectable shape of St. Mary's Church, something had been preserved for centuries. A passageway, a doctrine, a way of bending the human spirit. The official history says nothing, but the sealed ledgers and the banned testimonies whisper another version. You've been told churches sanctify. What they really do is bind. The Higgins family stumbled into this secret, and they paid the price. Picture the scene. A low October fog choking the churchyard, bells tolling with a tone that isn't quite right, and behind those black, iron doors an underground chamber older than any cathedral. Down there the walls sweat, the air shivers, and the symbols carved into limestone seem to shift as you stare. Imagine your own family stepping inside, guided by a trusted vicar, convinced they're exploring harmless traditions. But in truth, they're being initiated into a system of control perfected over centuries. This is not a ghost story. This is about power, ancient procedural, ritualized power, hidden inside rural respectability. Every detail you're about to hear comes from documents locked away for decades, and one witness who finally broke his silence. If you stay with me through this descent, I will show you how the Higgins case reveals a mechanism of control designed to erase people who break its codes. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The choice is yours now. Keep watching, step closer, and feel the floor of your old world start to tilt beneath you. Before the disappearance, there were signs. Small fractures in the everyday life of Ashworth that most mistook for coincidence. You have to understand how sealed off that village was in 1965. Its stone walls had outlived kings. Its lanes followed lines older than maps, and in every cottage window a candle burned the same way it had for centuries. This wasn't quaint tradition, it was programming. The slow shaping of human lives around a rhythm no one openly named. The Higgins family lived at the center of that rhythm, their cottage pressed against the shadow of St. Mary's, their lives braided into rituals they thought were harmless. They weren't. Elenina Higgins had been drifting toward the church's hidden teachings for years, reading books she wasn't supposed to touch, learning words that had been scrubbed from the liturgy. The vicar called it preservation of local heritage. But what he really offered was a way back to the old covenant. A covenant the Church of England buried, but never destroyed. Under the hymns and stained glass was another code, older, darker, more commanding, the kind that doesn't simply ask for belief but demands surrender. Thomas Higgins sensed it first. He began locking his ledger at the post office. He stopped speaking freely with neighbors. But his wife's eyes were already fixed somewhere past him. Down into that underground room, the children changed next. Margaret started copying symbols from tombstones. Billy drew the same robed figures again and again, each sketch a signal, a soft rehearsal of something coming. None of it was random. In systems like this, nothing is random. Imagine the power of a village that knows how to make its own people disappear without a scream, a police report, or a body. This is not superstition. This is infrastructure, a lattice of hidden agreements, centuries-deep networks, rituals that function like switches inside the mind. The Higgins family crossed a threshold, but it was built for them long before they were born. In Ashworth, the rituals weren't just practiced. They were engineered to continue. And the Higgins family, whether by curiosity, compulsion, or recruitment, became the next link in a chain of control stretching back to a time before England even had a name. By late October, the air over Ashworth thickened, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Outsiders passing through noticed nothing. A postcard hamlet wrapped in autumn colors. But to the initiated it was a season of alignment. This word appeared repeatedly in Elenina Higgins' hidden journals later recovered from beneath the church. Alignment wasn't just timing, it was permission. It was the moment when the veil between the surface and the underworld thinned, when those in power could reach up through ritual and tighten their grip on the human mind. Villagers whispered about harvest festivals and folk customs, but what really happened in those days had nothing to do with harvest. It had everything to do with programming collective obedience. Reverend Whitmore's sermons had shifted. Parishioners described them as dense, incantatory, even hypnotic. Lines from pre-Reformation texts crept into the liturgy. Children were asked to recite verses that no one could later find in any Bible. Thomas Higgins stopped taking communion altogether, but never told anyone why. Elenina began making nighttime journeys into the fog, carrying bundles of herbs and white candles purchased in bulk. In her own handwriting she wrote of locking memory sealed in stone, and teaching the children the old paths before the turning. What none of the villagers understood was that the rituals weren't just symbolic. They were mechanisms. Every repeated gesture, every carved emblem, every subterranean chant was a control system. By rehearsing the same shapes and sounds, the human nervous system becomes a loop the operator can exploit. This is how empires, religions, and secret orders have always worked. It's not mystical, it's procedural. The Higgins family were not victims of a random crime. They were being recalibrated by forces that saw them as conduits, not people. Picture the underground chamber beneath St. Mary's, rough limestone walls etched with spirals and key-like sigils, an altar worn smooth by centuries of hands, a ceiling so low grown men had to stoop. In that airless dark, sound behaves differently. Whispers travel like wires. The Higgins children were brought here as participants, not observers. They were asked to stand inside chalked circles and repeat phrases they barely understood. What began as historical curiosity became a contract, one written not in ink, but in the nervous systems of an entire family, a contract that would soon be sealed by disappearance. 3 nights before the disappearance, the bells of St. Mary's rang at an hour no one could explain. Not the clear, metallic peal of daylight, but a muffled toll rolling up from somewhere below the church. Mrs. Agnes Peaton swore she heard it coming from under the earth itself, as if the moorland was hollow. At that same moment, a single candle burned in every Higgins window, though Thomas later told the one surviving witness he hadn't lit them. This is the first sign of a deeper stage of the process. When the system begins acting through you rather than upon you, when your own hands move in service of codes you don't consciously recall. Elenina's journal notes for that night mention threshold inversion and family alignment complete. In the language of the hidden orders, this means the experiment had entered its irreversible phase. Once a household reached inversion, the boundaries of personal will dissolved. Think about that. Whole lives built on the illusion of autonomy can be rewritten by centuries. Old methods disguised as faith, tradition, or harmless ritual. This is how power survives revolutions. It doesn't resist, it embeds. Thomas tried to intervene. According to the sealed constabulary files, he visited the rectory that evening to confront Reverend Whitmore. No one knows what was said, but afterward Thomas was seen pacing the churchyard like a man stunned, his lips moving as if in prayer or recitation. He never returned to the post office the next morning. His ledger and satchel remained untouched on the kitchen table. Elenina's herbs, salt, and candles had been arranged into a geometric pattern on the floor, a design that matched markings found on a medieval manuscript locked in St. Mary's archives. This wasn't simply superstition. These were coordinates, a human ritual keyed to the architecture of the church itself, designed to open access to a place that is not on any map. That night the Higgins children drew the same spiral over and over again until their pencils broke. They called it the turning. In their eyes, the family was already halfway out of this world. And that's where the real question begins. Did they walk willingly into that underground room, or were they summoned by something engineered to summon them all along? After that night, the village moved as though under a shared trance. Market day passed in silence. The pub emptied earlier than usual. Curtains stayed drawn. Nobody asked questions aloud, but everyone felt the pressure in their chests. A pressure older than fear, older than memory. In systems like this, collective silence is not cowardice. It's conditioning. Generation after generation had been taught that some thresholds must not be named, that to speak them aloud is to call them closer. Yet the Higgins family, in their curiosity or desperation, had already crossed. Inside the rectory cellar, Reverend Whitmore prepared the final stage. According to the one surviving witness, the chamber under St. Mary's was arranged like a map of the village above. Every circle a cottage, every mark a life, all converging on a central point marked with an unbroken spiral. This is not metaphor. This is cartography of control. By replicating the above-ground community in an underground template, the ritual created a tether between the visible and the hidden, a loop that could draw a family down without anyone seeing. The Higgins children were no longer behaving like children. Margaret began speaking in riddles that matched banned passages from the York Psalter. Billy no longer drew people but doorways. Doorways opening into staircases, staircases winding into blackness. Illulanina's handwriting in her final journal entry was no longer hers. It slanted upward and curved, like the script carved into the limestone altar below the church. "The turning is near," she wrote. "All four will pass together. The path demands completion. This is the mechanism of power, to convince you that what is happening is inevitable, sacred, or historic, when in truth it is engineered to break your autonomy and feed the system." The villagers thought they were preserving history. They were preserving their own shackles. The Higgins family wasn't chosen at random. Their bloodline, their cottage, their proximity to St. Mary's, all of it made them ideal subjects for the final reenactment of a ritual the church had outlawed, but never dismantled. Ask yourself as you listen, how many of your own routines are truly yours, and how many were built centuries before you were born to guide you, gently but relentlessly, toward a doorway you can't yet see. By November 1st, the Higgins family was gone. No sign of forced entry, no bodies, no footprints leaving the cottage, only silence and a pattern scorched into the wooden floor. A spiral burned so cleanly it looked etched by a machine. The local constable sealed the property, but by then the investigation had already slipped out of his hands. Church officials arrived quietly at dawn, removed boxes from the rectory, and warned villagers not to speculate. This is how power behaves when it's cornered, not with drama, but with administration. A few forms signed in secret can erase whole lives more efficiently than violence. 3 months later, when a work crew opened the hidden chamber beneath St. Mary's, they found the Higgins' belongings neatly stacked, children's notebooks filled with spirals, Illulanina's herbs arranged by the altar, Thomas's satchel and ledger placed precisely in the center. The final journal entry was dated 2 weeks after their official disappearance. It read like a transmission from another place. "We have crossed. We are beneath and above. The turning holds." Police photographs from that day were sealed until the 1980s. Most remain classified. Understand what this means. This wasn't a crime scene in the traditional sense. It was an interface. a transfer point. The Higgins family had been rewritten, moved from one side of the system to another. You are meant to think of such stories as folklore, as urban legend, but folklore is the camouflage of institutional memory. Behind every myth sits a technique. Behind every mystery sits a method. What happened in Ashworth wasn't supernatural, it was procedural, built from architecture, ritual, and belief to function like a machine. And here's where you come in. I want you to pause and write in the comments, twice, the phrase, "I see the spiral." Do it not just for the algorithm, but to anchor this moment in your own mind. This is how we create a break in inherited programming. This is how you begin to choose what information lives inside you. Say it twice, write it twice, and let it become a signal you're awake, you're watching, and you're stepping past the point of no return. The Higgins family's fate is not just a story. It's a mirror. Once you've written the phrase, you've crossed your own line. The spiral is more than a symbol in the Higgins mystery. It's a pattern hidden everywhere authority wants you asleep. In Ashworth it was carved in limestone. In your life it hides in routines, permissions, and defaults. This is the deeper lesson of the Higgins case. A family doesn't vanish just because a village conspires. A family vanishes because every step leading to that moment has been pre-coded to make resistance unthinkable. That's the real power, not violence, but consent engineered in advance. After the Higgins disappearance, though official, explanation shifted weekly. First a family dispute, then financial trouble, then a secret move abroad. Every theory conveniently diverted attention from the church basement. Those who asked too many questions found themselves reassigned, silenced, or pressured into leaving the village. Constable Henley resigned within months. Mrs. Thornton, the librarian and custodian of banned manuscripts, suddenly donated her entire collection to the diocese and disappeared to live with relatives. Each disappearance erases another fragment of memory, until only the structure remains. The underground chamber was sealed with concrete in early 1966, but this was only the surface action. Records show a parallel set of construction orders filed under an obscure diocesan fund, suggesting the chamber was not destroyed but expanded. Imagine a secret archive built directly under the altar, reachable only by coded passage, holding the real history of Ashworth and places like it. This is the pattern you're starting to see. Events above ground serve as a diversion, while infrastructure deepens below. The Higgins case reveals how institutions use mystery as camouflage. When something is labeled inexplicable, the public stops demanding evidence and begins weaving myths. Myths are easier to manage than facts. This is why your entire culture is flooded with mystery content. It dilutes outrage into curiosity. But hidden inside every one of these stories is a map of power, a mechanism showing how people are selected, guided, and erased. If you've been following this far, you're no longer a passive listener. You're tracing the same contours the Higgins family traced, but with awareness they never had. Awareness is the first step in breaking a loop designed to close over you. By the winter of 1966, Ashworth looked the same on the surface. Stone cottages, frosted fields, Sunday bells. But the atmosphere had shifted into something colder, more watchful. People still nodded at each other in the square, but their eyes slid away. That is how power survives, not by overt terror, but by rewiring daily life so that silence feels safer than memory. In the Higgins house the windows were boarded, yet villagers swore they saw candlelight flicker behind the planks at night. A local boy claimed to hear children's voices from beneath the church during fog-heavy evenings. Each anomaly was dismissed as imagination, yet each anomaly matched a stage in the ritual texts later recovered. Those texts, written in a mix of Middle English and Latin, described a process called substructio, the building of a living foundation beneath a sacred site. Families were not just congregants but anchors. Their presence below the altar gave strength to the structure above, as though human life itself were a form of stone. This is how systems consume us, by presenting obedience as preservation, by convincing us that surrender is a duty. Once a person internalizes that, their disappearance doesn't feel like a crime but a fulfillment. In the years following the Higgins case, every attempt to publicize the hidden chamber failed. Newspapers ran short pieces but were warned off by diocesan lawyers. Even the police notes from 1965-1966 were quietly rewritten. A junior clerk later testified that whole pages vanished from the archives overnight. The effect was not just to erase evidence, but to create a vacuum into which speculation could pour. A controlled narrative in which the Higgins family became a mystery, instead of a case study in ritualized power. This is the core of institutional manipulation, not secrecy alone, but narrative dominance. By shaping what the public thinks is hidden, authorities can hide what's in plain sight. The Higgins disappearance is a microcosm of the same principle operating at national and global levels. In politics, media, and belief systems, what you're learning now is dangerous not because it's paranormal, but because it's procedural. Once you see the procedure, you can start dismantling its effect on you. And that, more than anything, is what the hidden orders fear. By the end of the 1970s, the Higgins case had become a ghostly rumor that flickered in local pubs and faded parish newsletters, but the infrastructure it exposed never went away. That's the genius of a well-engineered system. The surface story dies, the machinery survives. Beneath St. Mary's, the sealed chamber became a myth, yet maintenance workers reported seeing fresh mortar and new locks installed long after it was supposedly bricked up. A diocesan accountant later admitted under oath that a heritage preservation grant funded regular shipments to Ashworth labeled as archival supplies. None were ever catalogued. Paperwork is camouflage. Bureaucracy is the perfect invisibility cloak. By then, a handful of outsiders, journalists, folklorists, even an MP, tried to reopen the Higgins files. Every one of them found themselves facing subtle but decisive obstacles: lost mail, revoked access, sudden career trouble. This is how suppression operates at scale. Not through overt censorship, but through friction, fatigue, and reputation damage. After a while, most investigators tell themselves the case was never important to begin with, and yet the patterns kept reappearing in villages across Yorkshire, each with its own vanished family or sealed crypt, each with a church older than the Reformation, built over an even older site. In the surviving fragments of Ella Lenina's notes, photocopies smuggled out before the originals disappeared, she wrote about a spiral network, a series of sites linked by geometry rather than geography. She claimed each node reinforced the others like stones in an arch. Remove one and the rest would shift. It was not just about hiding people, it was about anchoring a worldview. Anchor enough minds, and the whole culture bends toward obedience without anyone noticing the curvature. This is why the Higgins story matters to you. It is not simply a macabre puzzle. It's a map of how control systems replicate themselves under the mask of tradition and heritage. The hidden orders count on you dismissing it as quaint local lore. But once you see how a single family's disappearance fits into a lattice of ritualized control, you start to glimpse the bigger architecture. And once you glimpse it, you're no longer inside the story they've written for you. You're standing outside, watching the machinery turn. By the mid-1980s, the dam cracked. A small window of freedom opened when a reformist wing inside the church briefly gained access to sealed records. For a few months, documents long buried were copied, whispered, passed hand to hand, before being pulled back into the vault. Among them was the inventory from beneath St. Mary's altar: measurements, sigils, dates of family anchors, and one line that changed everything: last completed turning, Higgins. That single phrase confirmed what many suspected. The disappearance wasn't an isolated tragedy, but a ritual cycle logged and overseen like an administrative task. Power loves paperwork because it converts the unthinkable into routine. One of the archivists who handled those files later gave testimony under condition of anonymity. He described diagrams showing concentric spirals connecting rural churches to larger cathedrals and then to urban nodes. In London, each site aligned to astronomical points, each annotated with surnames of long-standing parishioners. This was a map not just of geography, but of human inheritance. When people move, the power network adapts. When families stay for generations, the network deepens its roots. The Higgins family was both deeply rooted and symbolically placed, the ideal anchor. Around the same time, journalists tried again to publish. Their stories ran briefly, then vanished. Not retracted, vanished. Libraries logged the articles, but could no longer produce them. This is the sophistication you're up against, a mechanism that doesn't simply deny but erases. In the vacuum, myth rushes in, and the public clings to ghost stories rather than investigating procedure. Ghost stories are harmless to power. Procedural truth is not. Here's what you must understand now. The Higgins disappearance mirrors how institutions manage every large population. They build cathedrals of routine and tradition above ground and hidden chambers of influence below. Participation feels voluntary, even sacred, but your compliance is measured, mapped, and adjusted. The spiral isn't just under a Yorkshire church. It's embedded in your media feeds, your political rituals, your economic habits. Seeing it doesn't make it disappear, but it gives you leverage. You're stepping out of the hypnosis. Each new fact you learn about the Higgins case is really a fact about the architecture surrounding your own life. By the 1990s, the Higgins case had entered the age of the internet. The first bulletin boards about family vanishings and spiral churches appeared on slow, text-only forums. Without official records, researchers stitched together scraps, parish rolls, architectural blueprints, whispers from retired clergy. They noticed alignments not visible before, longitude, heritage, even the repetition of surnames in church committees. This was the era when conspiracy and evidence began to blur, when anyone with a modem could publish, but also when erasure evolved. Entire threads vanished overnight. Early websites archived the Higgins material, only to disappear into dead links a few months later. Digital forgetting became the new form of control. Yet even in this shadowy information war, patterns emerged. Satellite photos showed subtle anomalies around St. Mary's, odd depressions in the earth, air vents disguised as gravestones, a persistent heat signature in winter suggesting underground activity. Local historians uncovered property deeds indicating that the diocese still paid for maintenance tunnels. All of this hinted that the chamber had not been abandoned, but expanded into a larger substructure, perhaps even an archive or a laboratory for social modeling. The physical and the symbolic were merging into one machine. Meanwhile, new witnesses surfaced. Descendants of villagers began posting childhood memories, singing under the floorboards, candlelight through cracks, strange visits from church officials after dark. Many of these testimonies contradicted the official timeline, but matched each other. The emerging picture was of a slow, quiet continuation of the very process the Higgins family had undergone, only now adapted to a digital age. Instead of rituals in basements, rituals in code. Instead of ledgers in leather, ledgers in databases. This shift matters because it shows how the spiral persists. It doesn't live only in stone churches, but in infrastructures of data and policy. As physical evidence becomes harder to access, psychological and digital architectures take over, guiding behavior invisibly. The Higgins case thus stops being a parochial mystery and becomes a prototype, an early experiment in shaping perception and compliance. Understanding it now is less about solving an old disappearance and more about recognizing the template that may be steering your own reality without your consent. By the early 2000s, the Higgins case had transformed from a local legend into a quiet template for how to read the world. Forums, zines, and later podcasts framed it not as a true crime story, but as a symbolic warning about how control systems migrate and adapt. In Ashworth itself, the old stone church still stood, but much of the village had been redeveloped into commuter housing. The physical traces of the spiral, marks in the wood, scorch lines in the cellar, had been sanded, painted, or buried. Yet the pattern persisted in subtler forms: zoning maps, utility routes, mobile, mast placements all traced familiar concentric arcs if you knew where to look. The environment itself had become the ritual. Investigators who followed the digital trail noticed that the same surnames and committee members that had once run the parish hall were now attached to planning boards, grant agencies, and regional heritage trusts. It was the same web, merely updated for an era of data and governance. Where the Higgins family once supplied an anchor, now populations were anchored by mortgages, identity numbers, and predictive analytics. Compliance was no longer achieved by a candlelit ceremony in a basement, but by code and contract written into everyday life. In this phase of the story, the spiral stops being an exotic curiosity and becomes a metaphor for how power survives revolutions, regime changes, and technological upheavals. Each ring in the spiral represents a layer of consent, tradition, law, infrastructure, convenience, wrapped around your life until it feels like part of nature. Understanding the Higgins case now means seeing how every system hides its mechanisms behind symbols, rituals, and supposedly neutral procedures. This section matters because it marks the pivot from past to present. The Higgins family is gone, but the pattern that consumed them has migrated into the networks you use every day. The case is no longer a gothic disappearance in a moorland village. It's an instruction manual for how your own choices are shaped and your attention guided. Seeing it clearly does not solve it overnight, but it breaks the trance and lets you step outside the loop. The first true act of resistance the Higgins never got to make. 2 decades into the 21st century, the Higgins mystery became less a question of what happened, and more a question of what does it reveal about us now. Researchers began drawing parallels between the old spiral carved beneath St. Mary's and the feedback loops of modern algorithms, systems that learn your habits, predict your movements, and adjust your environment until your choices fit a pre-designed pattern. The term digital parish started appearing in forums, suggesting that we've all become parishioners of invisible cathedrals built from code rather than stone. In this framing, the Higgins family was not an anomaly, but an early warning sign, a demonstration of how tightly behavior can be mapped, nudged, and harvested. In Ashworth, the church grounds were turned into a heritage attraction. Tourists arrived to photograph the mystery site, without realizing that the narrative itself had been curated by the same institutions that once sealed the chamber. Plaques and pamphlets reframed the disappearance as folklore, offering no mention of the sealed police files, the missing parish records, or the satellite anomalies. This is another form of the spiral: to convert your inquiry into consumption, your suspicion into a souvenir. What you can photograph, you stop investigating. Meanwhile, the pattern's persistence became clearer in policy. Surveillance cameras, predictive policing, and data broker networks expanded quietly, justified as convenience or safety. Every ring of the spiral was now digital and global, but the logic was unchanged: draw people into routines, normalize observation, make participation feel like tradition or civic duty. Where once a hidden chamber under a church captured a family, now entire populations could be anchored through invisible architectures of code, finance, and law. Understanding this doesn't require believing in dark rituals. It requires noticing how systems train your expectations so you won't resist. The Higgins case is still valuable not as a conspiracy, but as a lens, a way of seeing how myths, Institutions and infrastructures interlock to direct human lives. In a sense, following this story has been an initiation, not into fear, but into awareness. Each detail you've read about Ashworth is a mirror for your own environment, and recognizing that mirror is the first step in walking a path that isn't pre-scripted for you. By the 2020s, the Higgins story had moved almost completely out of dusty archives and into podcasts, docuseries, and speculative forums. Every new retelling stripped away a little more of the Gothic atmosphere and focused instead on the pattern behind it. The way one small disappearance could map a larger architecture of control. In Ashworth itself, the heritage tours became slicker, more curated. The chamber was still sealed, but a replica had been built for tourists, complete with a gift shop. This is one of the spiral's last tricks. When exposure becomes unavoidable, it converts the threat into spectacle, and spectacle neutralizes action. People take selfies where the Higgins children once played. They leave convinced they've learned the truth, when in fact they've been shepherded back into a managed narrative. Outside the tourist zone, a few independent researchers kept working quietly. They tracked patterns of funding, property transfers, and unexplained subterranean construction across several counties. Their findings suggested that what began under Satan, Mary's had scaled up, not as ritual sacrifice but as a model for managing populations through interlocking systems. In their view, the spiral was no longer a literal design, but a behavioral loop replicated in digital networks, zoning laws, and algorithmic governance. The physical chamber under Ashworth had been only the pilot site. In this phase, the story shifts from eerie local mystery to something uncomfortably familiar. You don't need a candlelit basement to anchor a population anymore. A mobile phone app or a mortgage can achieve the same steady pull. The same logic that drew the Higgins family toward its turning now draws millions into loops of scrolling, debt, surveillance, and reward. Seeing that continuity is the purpose of telling this story in the first place. And here's the critical takeaway. You are not reading about a haunted family. You are reading about a mechanism. Ghost stories end when the ghost is appeased. Mechanisms end only when people see them, name them, and choose to step outside them. The Higgins case is a lens, not a legend. Looking through it, you can start to see how your own life is mapped, nudged, and anchored. And from that vantage point, you can start to choose a different direction. This is the moment where the veil thins. You've followed the Higgins family into the dark. You've seen how the chamber beneath St. Mary's was not just stone and candlelight, but a template. Now pause. Look at your own hands. Look at the glow of the screen you're holding. Ask yourself, who benefits from you hearing this story? Who benefits from you never questioning it? The most effective prisons don't need bars. They need stories that frame your world so completely that you don't realize you're inside a design. That was the secret Reverend Whitmore understood. That was the bargain the old families of Ashworth struck, and that is why this story was never meant to reach you. They built a loop, a spiral of belief, obedience, and ritual. It started with carved stones and forbidden rites, but it didn't end there. It migrated into institutions, documents, councils, and screens. The power doesn't live in a basement. It lives in your consent, your habits, your reflex to look away. When you finally see that, when you stop playing your assigned role, the spiral begins to crack. That's why forbidden knowledge is dangerous. It doesn't just inform you. It gives you leverage over your own programming. Right now, at this point in the video, type the phrase, "The spiral breaks," twice in the comments. This isn't superstition. This is a symbolic act. It tells the algorithms that you're awake. And it tells your own subconscious that you've crossed a threshold. The people who designed these loops count on your passivity. Break that expectation. Signal to yourself that you've shifted identity from observer to actor. Because here's the last revelation. The Higgins family didn't vanish to terrify you. They vanished to show you what happens when curiosity collides with control. Their story is a warning and an invitation. You're not supposed to just know about the chamber. You're supposed to build your own exit when you feel the tug of the spiral. In your feed, your routines, your compromises. Remember what we uncovered here. Knowledge without action is just another loop. Knowledge with action is a key. The door may be hidden, but now you've felt it under your fingertips. Turn it, step through. Don't look back.